Before European ships reached the shores of West Africa, Igbo society flourished in what is now southeastern Nigeria. A complex civilization with decentralized governance, sophisticated religious systems, and vibrant cultural traditions. But beginning in the 16th century, a dark shadow would fall across this land, initiating centuries of trauma whose echoes still resonate today. The Igbo people were one of the most heavily affected ethnic groups during the transatlantic slave trade. The Bight of Biafra, which includes present-day southeastern Nigeria, where Igboland is situated, supplied approximately 14.6% of all enslaved Africans transported to the Americas between 1650 and 1900. This represents an estimated 1.5 million Igbo people who were forcibly removed from their homeland during this period. The major embarkation points for enslaved Igbo were the ports of Bonny and Old Calabar. These coastal trading centers became notorious for the volume of human trafficking that occurred through them. Records from European slave ships indicate that the highest concentration of Igbo captives were transported during the 18th century, with the trade continuing well into the 19th century until abolition efforts began to take effect. Igbo society before the Atlantic slave trade was characterized by a sophisticated social organization that balanced individual achievement with communal responsibility. Unlike the centralized kingdoms that dominated many parts of West Africa, most Igbo communities operated through decentralized systems of governance. Authority was widely distributed among councils of elders, age-grade associations. Decisions required broad consensus, reflecting the Igbo proverb, Igbo enwe eze, the Igbo have no king. The pre-slave trade economy centered on agriculture, particularly yam cultivation, palm oil production, and regional trade networks. Specialized crafts flourished, including blacksmithing, pottery, and textile production. Local currencies like iron rods and cowrie shells facilitated commerce across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Igbo spiritual life was anchored in reverence for Chukwu, the supreme deity, and a pantheon of lesser gods, including Allah, the earth goddess who governed morality and fertility. Ancestors were venerated as intermediaries between the living and the spiritual realm. Divination systems like AFA helped interpret the will of spiritual forces. Cultural expression manifested through masquerade traditions, music, dance, and oral literature that preserved historical knowledge and ethical values. Body art, including scarification patterns, marked important life transitions and cultural identity, marks that would later identify Igbo people in the diaspora. Prior to the Atlantic slave trade, slavery existed in Igbo society, but in forms dramatically different from the plantation slavery that would develop in the Americas. Enslaved individuals, often war captives or those convicted of serious crimes, could be integrated into families over time, and their children typically did not inherit slave status. The first European contacts with the Bight of Biafra region came in the late 15th and early 16th centuries when Portuguese vessels explored the West African coast. By the late 16th century, Portuguese traders were joined by Dutch, French, and English competitors. European demand for labor in New World plantations was growing exponentially. By the mid-17th century, the slave trade had become the dominant form of commerce in the Bight of Biafra. European ships anchored offshore, while African intermediaries managed the actual procurement of captives from the interior. Kidnapping became rampant, with individuals or small groups seizing vulnerable people working in fields or traveling along isolated paths.
The slave trade created a profound insecurity in everyday life. Historical accounts tell us that people feared working alone in distant fields or traveling between communities. This constant threat transformed social relations and created deep suspicion between neighboring groups.
Central to the slave trade in Igboland was the rise of the Aro Confederacy. The Aro established a powerful trading network centered on their oracle, Ibini Ukpabi, known to Europeans as the Long Juju. The Aro claimed their oracle could resolve disputes and identify guilty parties in cases of theft, murder, or witchcraft. Those who disappeared into the oracle were often secretly sold into slavery. British colonial shipping records, analyzed by historian David Eltis, indicate that from 1698 to 1778 alone, approximately 25,000 Igbo people were disembarked in colonial Virginia. trading diaspora communities established throughout Igboland served as collection points for captives who would then be marched to coastal ports. While European demand drove the transatlantic slave trade, it is crucial to recognize the roles played by local leaders and merchants within Igboland itself. Historical accounts reveal figures like Nwabani Ogogo Oriaku, a powerful 19th-century Igbo slave trader who worked directly with European merchants. Individuals such as Oriaku often gained significant wealth and political influence through their participation in the trade, exchanging captives for European goods like firearms, alcohol, and textiles. This collaboration not only intensified the flow of people out of Igboland, but also reshaped local economies and power structures, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the era of the slave trade had ended. By the mid-18th century, the Bight of Biafra had become one of the most intensive slave exporting regions in West Africa. Between 1650 and 1900, approximately 1.5 million people were shipped across the Atlantic from this region, with the Igbo making up a substantial portion of this number. The principal ports exporting Igbo captives included Bonny, Calabar, and Elem Kalabari. Unlike other regions where European forts dominated the coast, trade in the Bight of Biafra operated through African intermediaries who controlled access to the interior through the complex Niger Delta waterways. The journey that awaited captives was horrific. The Middle Passage across the Atlantic typically took 6 to 8 weeks. Captives were packed into ships under inhumane conditions, with mortality rates averaging 15%. The slave trade profoundly disrupted Igbo society. Population loss affected community viability, agricultural production, and cultural transmission. Communities responded to the growing insecurity by developing new defensive strategies. Settlements relocated to more easily defended hilltops or forest locations. Religious practices adapted to address new threats. Protective charms and medicines gained importance as people sought spiritual security in an increasingly dangerous world. Some villages surrounded themselves with walls and moats. Many communities formed defensive pacts and developed more aggressive military capabilities.
The slave trade didn't just extract people, it transformed the entire social fabric. Communities became more militarized, more suspicious of outsiders. Economic activities shifted as certain areas became too dangerous for farming or trade. These adaptations represent remarkable resilience in the face of extraordinary pressure.
Across the Atlantic, Igbo captives established new communities under the brutal conditions of plantation slavery. Their cultural practices, religious beliefs, and resistance strategies shaped slave societies throughout the Americas. In Virginia, Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, and elsewhere, Igbo people maintained elements of their identity despite systematic attempts to erase their culture. Igbo religious concepts found new expressions in diaspora communities. The Igbo belief in reincarnation manifested in the concept of flying back to Africa after death. Spiritual practices merged with those of other African groups and over time incorporated elements of Christianity, creating syncretic religions like Vodun in Haiti and Obeah in Jamaica. Igbo captives gained a reputation for resistance and suicide rather than submission to slavery. Plantation owners in the American South sometimes specifically avoided purchasing Igbo captives, considering them prone to melancholy and rebellion. This stereotype reflected both cultural misunderstanding and recognition of Igbo resistance to enslavement. One of the most powerful examples of Igbo resistance occurred in 1803 on St. Simon's Island, Georgia. A group of Igbo captives who had survived the Middle Passage took control of their slave ship and grounded it in Dunbar Creek. Rather than face slavery, they walked into the water in a mass suicide, reportedly singing, "The water spirit brought us, the water spirit will take us home." This event, known as Igbo Landing, has become a powerful symbol of resistance to oppression. The story lives on in the Gullah Geechee communities of coastal Georgia and South Carolina, and has inspired numerous works of literature and art, including Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust, and Toni Morrison's novel Song of Solomon.
Igbo Landing represents the ultimate form of resistance, choosing death over enslavement. But it's also about spiritual return, the belief that through death, one could return to the homeland. This narrative has become central to African American cultural memory, a testament to both the horror of slavery and the enduring power of resistance.
In 1807, Britain abolished its slave trade after decades of abolitionist campaigning. Britain established the West Africa Squadron to patrol the coast and intercept slave ships. Between 1808 and 1860, the squadron captured approximately 1,600 slave ships and freed about 150,000 Africans. Despite these efforts, the illegal slave trade continued. Spanish, Portuguese, and American ships continued to transport captives across the Atlantic. As the slave trade declined, European commercial interests in Igboland shifted toward legitimate commerce, primarily palm oil, which was needed for industrial lubricants, soap, and later, margarine. By the 1850s, the Bight of Biafra was exporting over 25,000 tons of palm oil annually. Igbo communities adapted to this economic shift, expanding palm production and developing new trade networks. This economic transition created new opportunities for wealth accumulation and social mobility. In 1857, the Church Missionary Society established its first permanent mission in Igboland at Onitsha. Led by Samuel Ajayi Crowther, an African bishop and former slave, the mission began the process of Christian evangelization that would profoundly transform Igbo society. The missionaries brought not only a new religion, but also Western education and medicine. Early converts gained literacy and access to new economic opportunities. Conversion often created social tensions, as Christians rejected traditional religious practices and social obligations. Some early converts were ostracized or persecuted. Following the missionaries came commercial firms with more explicit imperial ambitions. The United Africa Company, established by George Goldie in 1879, began consolidating British commercial interests. In 1886, the Royal Niger Company received a charter from the British government, granting it administrative powers over the Niger River Basin. This fusion of commercial and political authority represented a critical step toward formal colonization. By the 1890s, European powers were engaged in the scramble for Africa, carving the continent into colonial territories. Britain was preparing for more direct control over what would become Nigeria. The demographic impact of the slave trade on Igboland was profound. While precise numbers remain debated, historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, hundreds of thousands of Igbo people were exported across the Atlantic. This population loss affected gender ratios, age distributions, and settlement patterns. Recovery was gradual, with significant population growth only resuming in the early 20th century. Across the Atlantic, Igbo cultural influences persisted despite the brutality of slavery. Linguistic elements survived in diaspora communities. The Jamaican patois word unu, meaning you all, comes directly from the Igbo language. Religious concepts, musical forms, dance styles, and foodways all show evidence of Igbo heritage. Today, genetic testing allows many African Americans to trace their ancestry to specific regions of Africa. For those with Igbo heritage, this can provide a powerful connection to a specific cultural identity that slavery attempted to erase. Increasing numbers of diaspora Igbo are reconnecting with their ancestral homeland through heritage tourism and cultural exchange.
What's remarkable is not just that elements of Igbo culture survived the Middle Passage and slavery, but that they continue to evolve and influence broader American cultures. From linguistic patterns to musical innovations, from religious concepts to resistance strategies, Igbo contributions to diaspora cultures have been substantial and enduring.
Today, sites associated with the slave trade have become places of pilgrimage and remembrance. In Nigeria, locations like Badagry and Calabar have developed memorials and museums that document this painful history. These sites attract visitors from the diaspora, seeking connection with their ancestral past. In Arochukwu, the cave complex that once housed the Ibini Ukpabi Oracle is now a historical monument. The site attracts both tourists and those seeking to understand this complex chapter of Igbo history. Throughout Igboland, annual cultural festivals celebrate traditional practices while increasingly acknowledging connections to diaspora communities. Events like the Ahia-Joku lecture series explore Igbo history and culture, including the impact and legacies of the slave trade era. The slave trade era represents a profound trauma in Igbo history, yet it also reveals extraordinary resilience. Despite the extraction of people and the disruption of communities, Igbo society adapted, survived, and eventually recovered. Today, growing connections between Igboland and diaspora communities represent a form of healing across the rupture created by the slave trade. Understanding this history is essential not only for comprehending the past, but for addressing contemporary issues of global inequality, racism, and cultural identity. The story of the Igbo through the slave trade era is ultimately about human capacity for both exploitation and resilience, destruction and creation, separation and reconnection.